I'll do and or. All right, so what comes after that? Right, so for this again, you could also just put pharynx. All right, so what comes after the pharynx? So remember, in digestion, it was the esophagus, right? So what is it for respiration?
The larynx.
The larynx, right. All right, and then what comes after that? Yep, the trachea. All right, and then what happens at the end of the trachea?
Primary.
Right, so you have two lungs, right? So the trachea has to branch both ways. So you branch into the primary. So when I do one with that symbol up there, that means primary. All right, that's just my short way of writing it.
Okay.
So it goes to primary bronchi. All right, so remember that's the very first branch in your trachea. All right, so I could draw it like that, so it branches, and then each primary, I'll write this a little bit so it's easier to understand. It's going to be kind of redundant. All right, so those are going to be the primary bronchi, and then each one of those branches into secondary. All right, and then I'm not going to write all of them, but these ones then again branch into the tertiary. All right, does that make sense? On your exam, you don't have to write all of this. You just can write trachea to an arrow primary, an arrow down to secondary, and then another arrow to tertiary. This is just to show you how many branches there actually are, just down to 3. All right, so if I just pick one of these 3, all right, what comes after that? At 3, all right, so those we'll just say goes to the terminal. So it goes to the terminal bronchioles. All right, and so remember at the end of that are going to be the alveoli. All right, so eventually when you get down to a bronchiole, if you look at the branch, all right, so this is a terminal bronchiole, you'll actually see something like this at the end of each one. All right, and these are covered in alveoli. So it kind of looks like a bunch of grapes hanging on the end of it. All right, so these are all going to be alveoli. This right here is going to be your terminal bronchiole. All right, so that's why once you get to the end of that, then you get into that ball or the bundle of alveoli. All right, and so at the alveoli, that's where you have gas exchange. All right, and so we are going to end this part of the flowchart here, and I'm going to go on to this other part of the board to look further into gas exchange. But remember, just like this exam, if I ask you for the direction of the flow, all right, so you could just make a key saying this way is in, and all the way back is out. Anything like that, all right? So we're going to zoom in on this gas exchange. So when you are in the alveoli, all right, you have oxygen, all right, so if you inhale, this whole process we just drew occurs, all right, all the way down to the alveoli. And so once we're in the alveoli, you have oxygen there, so that's from breathing in. All right, so does anybody remember how the concentration gradients work? Because those are coming back into play here, all right? So if we have high oxygen somewhere and we have low oxygen somewhere else, which way is oxygen want to travel? Right, it always goes high to low. So if it's a solute, it goes high to low. All right, so remember, this is the blood going back to the lungs. This is deoxygenated and it needs to pick up more oxygen. So you're always going to have high oxygen here, and then here you're going to have low oxygen. All right, so at each of these steps, if you can draw which one of these two happens, you know that because there's less oxygen here, it diffuses across the membrane. All right, so these are going to be, this line I just drew is going to represent the simple squamous layer of the alveoli. And so you have gas diffusing across from a higher to a lower concentration. All right, so then you have oxygen, and then that enters the red blood cell where it binds with hemoglobin, which I'm just going to write as HB. All right, so this will be in the red blood cell. All right, so once this travels to the tissue, all right, so what do you think the oxygen situation is like in the tissue? Right, so these have been undergoing metabolism, so this has low oxygen. And the blood, from picking up all the oxygen from the alveoli, what do you think the concentration is like now?
High.
Right, so now it's high here. So which way does oxygen want to go once it gets to the tissue?
The lower gradient.
Right, it wants to go from high to low again. So here you have hemoglobin releasing the oxygen, and this also goes across the membrane into the tissue. All right, so this is just one half of the equation. This is how oxygen gets to the tissue. But remember, the other half of respiration is carbon dioxide leaving. All right? So down here, we're going to draw CO2 from metabolism. All right, so what's the concentration of CO2 like if the cells have been producing it? Yep, so relative to the blood, it's going to be higher. All right, and so what do you think the CO2 here is going to be? Right, so it'll be low in the blood because it just carried all the oxygen, all right? So again, because you have high and low, carbon dioxide goes across the membrane. All right, and then like we said, that combines with water. All right, and then that produces H2CO3. All right, so that's carbonic acid. And then that can dissociate into hydrogen and bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus. That carbonic anhydrase enzyme we talked about, that catalyzes this first part. So Ca is for carbonic anhydrase. All right. And so this is all happening in the red blood cell. All right, so this right here, the free hydrogen we have, it binds to hemoglobin. All right, so we're going to do hydrogen plus hemoglobin, just like oxygen did up there. And then remember, this bicarbonate ion gets sent out of the red blood cell. So we just have HCO3 minus. All right, does anyone remember what goes in place of the bicarbonate ion? So it's called the chloride shift. All right, so you have chloride ions in your plasma. Because you have a negative charge leaving the red blood cell, in order to balance that, it brings a negative charge back in. We're not going to worry about where this comes from or what happens once it enters. Just know that when bicarbonate leaves, you have chloride entering also. All right. And so in 318, you'll learn more about why this is important. All right, so you can see it's a negative charge. So if your blood gets too acidic, all right, when your blood's too acidic, it has too much hydrogen ions in it. And so this will actually bind to those and help combat the acidity of your blood.
Is it a buffer?
It's a buffer, right. So this is called the bicarbonate buffer system. And again, you don't need to know that in detail until 318, but your blood needs to have a very specific pH, all right? And so this is a very important mechanism of how to regulate that pH. All right, so we still have to get the carbon dioxide back into the alveoli to be exhaled. All right, so what happens is these red blood cells travel all the way back to the lungs. And then what happens is when it gets to this membrane where you have a concentration gradient again, all right, that concentration gradient forces this reaction to go all the way backwards. All right, so the reason why it goes all this way before it gets to the lungs is to act as a buffer system. And by buffer system, these are always going back and forth. All right, so if there's too much acid, bicarbonate will come out and combat that. So these equations are going back and forth as a buffer system. But once you get to this membrane, you have bicarbonate going back into the red blood cell, all right? And then you have the reverse reaction. So you have bicarbonate forming carbonic acid, and then that is breaking down into water and carbon dioxide. All right, so remember, right from the tissue, it went this direction, and then once we get back to the membrane, all right, so I'll draw an arrow. It goes all the way in the opposite direction, all right? And so if the blood has picked up all the carbon dioxide from tissue, what's the concentration like in the blood now?
Lower?
So it'll be high, all right? So does that make sense? If the blood is going by, picking up all of the CO2 from the tissue, it's gonna build up CO2, all right? So down here you can make a note, the CO2 is high, all right? And then remember at the lungs here, it's going to be low, all right? All right, so once the equation goes all the way backwards, this carbon dioxide goes across the membrane. All right, and then you would exhale.